So those are all color ink devices. And if someone told me 2 years ago that we'd see that many in 2024, I honestly wouldn't have believed it. But as you can see by the sheer number of color ink devices being available right now, there's been a bit of a silent revolution going on the ink market. Mainly Boox, PocketBook and Bigme have been releasing color ink e-readers and tablets one after another for some time now. But the real game changer was Kobo entering the ring with the Clara color and the Libra color. Because now color ink finally hit the mainstream market and many wonder if it's actually worth the hype or if it's just better to sit this one out and just stick to the good old black and white e-reader, at least for now. To answer that, let's take a step back and first talk about ink in general to also get a better understanding of the pros and cons of color ink. So let's quickly talk about what's so special about ink and why it's still around after so many years when you can also just read on your iPad or smartphone. Ink was essentially said to be dead so many times I've lost count. Especially when the tablet market took off, it was an important talking point. Because at that time, it looked like companies fully expected customers to make the jump to tablets and abandon dedicated e-readers completely. But that didn't happen. Same as it didn't happen with tablets replacing laptops or the PC. So why didn't customers switch to LCDs when those got better and better and instead still stuck to ink? Because let's be honest, ink kinda sucks if you just go by what you can do with it. One of the biggest advantages of ink over many years was the longer battery life of dedicated e-readers. Instead of just a couple of hours with a tablet, they would run for days and even weeks on one charge. The reason? An ink display doesn't need energy once the contents on the screen are in place. More on that in a second. But that wasn't the most important thing. The real benefit of ink was always, and still is, the paper-like appearance. Ink reflects and diffuses incoming light, so it's a reflective technology. A typical LCD mostly blocks and absorbs surrounding light. And as a result, you can't really see anything if you don't dial up the backlight's brightness enough. The way ink in e-readers typically works is by using microcapsules with black and white ink particles in the display. You can actually see them pretty well with a microscope on this old Kindle right here. On newer models, there are usually a couple of additional layers on the screen, so clarity is a bit worse. That's why I'm using this old Kindle without a touch screen to get a better view of the capsules. And once those particles are in place, the screen doesn't draw any power until it needs to change the displayed content again. So you can show an image essentially indefinitely once it's set. So besides the paper-like look and feel that comes as a result, there's also very little glare compared to many other display types. And you can also use ink in direct sunlight without issues. In fact, ink works better the more ambient light there is essentially. But ink had two downsides. The first one being that you needed an external light source. Because of the way ink works, you can't use a backlight. So reading on the very first dedicated ink e-readers always needed enough ambient light, like with that old Kindle right here. That changed when the first e-readers with built-in lights were released, like the Kobo Glow for example. Instead of a backlight, the light is coming from LCDs located in the front of the screen, hidden in the bezel, and is distributed with a light carrier film as evenly as possible. This approach of illuminating ink is still in use in today's e-readers. And that's why we're talking about a front light and not a backlight when talking about e-readers. The second downside was ghosting and how slow ink essentially is. So this tech isn't really meant to be super dynamic. Although, on a side note, even that changed recently. But many people thought that its somewhat static performance always held ink back. But honestly, I think it's the other way around, at least for me. Especially because ink limited what you could do with it, it always worked as a digital detox without completely cutting yourself off from the digital world. I always thought it offered a great compromise for using a digital device without all the distractions that come with tablets and smartphones. So that second con wasn't really a huge deal in my opinion. And it looks like many people were happy with that as well, because as a consequence, ink never really disappeared, and it's still going strong actually. Which now brings us to color ink. When talking about color ink, it's important to note that there are actually two different technologies being actively developed. And I'm talking about what's available in 2024. It might be different in a year or two, so make sure to check out my recent videos if you're watching this one later. The first color ink technology is using the exact same approach with microcapsules as I mentioned before. But instead of just using black and white particles, there are now colored particles with cyan, magenta, yellow, and white capsules. This green technology is called Advanced Color ePaper, or more specifically, the version for the end consumer market is called Ink Gallery 3. This is essentially the end game for color ink. We've been waiting for many years now. And for a second, it actually looked like we'd get that color revolution with this kind of technology in 2023, when ink announced mass production for Gallery 3 screens. But there seem to be some issues, and in the end, only the relatively unknown Chinese company Bigme released one 8-inch tablet with Gallery 3, and it wasn't actually very good. Check out my review to learn more about that. So we're still waiting for that kind of colored microcapsules technology, which Ink hinted in a recent investors report that we'll see an improved version in 2024. But when or even if that happens isn't clear after the first Gallery 3 launch didn't really take off. The second technology is called Ink Kaleido, and this is the one that's actually now fueling the current hype for color ink we're seeing. Ink Kaleido 3 is the technology that's being used in the Kobo Libra Color, the PocketBook Inkpad Color 3, or the Boox Tab Mini C, or essentially most of these devices right here. The approach on how this works is a bit different than what I explained before. Instead of colored particles, it uses the exact same setup with black and white particles as a regular black and white ink screen. To generate colors, there is an additional layer on top of the ink screen with red, green, and blue subpixels. To generate colors, the ink screen underneath those subpixels is darkened selectively. So to the naked eye, only the needed color is visible, because the spots where the screen is darkened doesn't reflect much light, and as a result, the color above the dark spots isn't really visible. This approach can generate up to 4096 colors, which is not incredibly much compared to Ink Gallery 3 or a modern LCD, but still good enough for many contents that you typically view on a screen like this. And that finally brings us to the question if color ink is actually worth the hype right now. So let's talk about the pros and cons of Ink Kaleido 3 and the current color ink devices with that specific tech. The biggest advantage is obviously having colors. You only really notice how much you miss them when you make the switch to one of these new ereaders or tablets. Just having colored book covers simply makes the user experience better. Sounds strange, but it's totally true, at least for me. But obviously it gets even better if you look at colored content more often, like comics, magazines, and so on. That's really where this type of screen starts to shine, and I love using color ink devices because of that. It's actually really hard to go back to a black and white ink screen after having used one of the color ink screens for a while. The second advantage of color ink is that you can also use it without any issues outdoors in direct sunlight. Same as regular ink, this tech only gets better with more light hitting the screen because it's reflected. So taking your color ink device with you and enjoy your reading time out in the sun isn't an issue, which is something you can't say for regular LCD screens. But there are some important downsides to color ink you need to know. The first one being the overall darker appearance of the screen. Remember the RGB layer I talked about? Because that layer is passive and not completely transparent, it's always visible. The individual subpixels are so small with the latest Kaleido generation that they aren't really perceivable with a regular reading distance, but they still darken the screen because they absorb parts of the incoming light. So if you like reading on ink without using the front light, Ink Kaleido 3 isn't for you. Dialing up the front light gets rid of this issue easily and the screen is perfectly readable as a result. But not using the front light indoors with this color tech isn't really a comfortable reading experience in my opinion. The second issue is the graininess of the screen. Again, it comes down to the RGB pixels. As I mentioned, they are always visible, and I suspect because the red, green and blue subpixels absorb light differently, there's a bit of grain and shimmering when looking at a screen like this. This effect is actually really hard to capture on camera, and it's much more subtle with Kaleido 3 compared to older Kaleido generations, but it's still there. Same as the darker appearance, it's really not a huge deal in my opinion, because it's not super obvious and isn't really noticeable with a regular reading distance in my experience, but it's still something to look out for because a black and white ink screen simply looks cleaner and doesn't have this grain to it. And the last downside is color saturation. You've probably already noticed it, but I just want to point it out again. Colors on Kaleido 3 are muted. You won't see the same vibrant colors as on a tablet or smartphone. Boox called this color palette pastel, and I tend to agree that this is a pretty accurate term for what we get with color ink right now. But even with those muted colors, having them is still a big plus in my opinion, compared to black and white screens. Color ink easily wins the comparison to a regular black and white screen when looking at comics or other colored content. Did I wish the colors were a bit more vibrant? Sure. But just having them the way they are already adds so much to the user experience that, as I said, it's hard to switch back. So should you get a color ink e-reader or tablet? I'd say it depends. Personally, I love having colors on ink. And looking at my recent video reviews, I think it's safe to say that I'm a big fan of color ink devices. And I'm also confident in saying that color ink is the future and that generally slow development of the ink market will get a bit faster in the next couple of years because of this new tech. I also think that Ink Kaleido 3 is now the point where it totally makes sense to use it when using an e-reader for both comics and pure text ebooks. But if you're just reading regular text ebooks without any pictures and never look at color content on your e-reader at any point, I wouldn't recommend switching right away. Sure, having color book covers are still great. And even though I think the mentioned downsides aren't huge issues in everyday use, I do think black and white ink still is the better choice for pure text ebooks with fewer compromises. The brighter and cleaner background of black and white ink is just a bit easier on the eyes if you ask me. So hopefully that helped with your decision whether to switch to color ink or not. Like and subscribe if that's the case. Thanks for your time watching and see you in the next one.